Welcome back. For those who are with us this morning, welcome to folks who are just joining us now for this Festival of Resilience. Wait a second, I got a couple more things to do. I'm working getting everybody on so you can see us. We got okay, nices. Our interpreter, thank you for joining us again. Great to have you. So welcome everybody. So we were thinking about today when Starhawk and I were designing today. We're like, inauguration's happening. Like people are losing their minds. Like what happened? We wanted to give some hope. Like what can we do? Like what are some solutions? Because we have so many, and I think it's easy to fall in the trap of things are so bad. Which we can't ignore. There's some scary stuff going on, but we have some really great solutions. So we got some solution-focused conversation. It's going to lead off with Erik Ohlsen here, who's going to take us down the path of water-based solutions, I think. So I'm going to pass it up to you, Erik.
Okay, well, hello everyone. I was involved a little bit this morning, just listening in, and just grateful for everyone who's circling up and sharing their thoughts and feelings today. The more that we knit our resilient communities, the more we connect to support each other, inspire, the more we develop mutual aid systems, we can get through really hard times. And the shift now in this conversation is to some of the more physical aspects of what it means to live on Earth, some of the vital components of living in resilience, of being prepared for catastrophe, of planning for climate change, climate adaptation. So I'm really going to focus on water today. And it may seem like a strange jump from expressing how we feel and building resistance against a new Trump era to then talk about water. But let's just remember a few things that Trump has promised to do, which is increase oil and gas drilling, cut the EPA, and the ramifications that this has for ecosystems, for communities, for the safety of our communities is it's massive. It's a massive moment. And sometimes it can feel a little, I feel a bit of despair. I've been doing this kind of work, permaculture and ecological activism for about 25 years. And to see the scale of destruction that sort of keeps coming, it can be really heartbreaking. But those of us on the ground who work with water and soil and plants and animals and climate and our community, we see beauty every single day. We see strength of community. We see people supporting each other and the ecosystem every single day. So there are things to be hopeful about, and we can't measure the level of restoration happening on the planet right now. It's very difficult to measure this, and I'm going to share a little bit of a slideshow. Um, and let's give me one sec to get this going here. Okay, so the thing is that the positive things that are happening on the earth right now are difficult to measure because of their decentralized nature. And as we get into this, we'll talk a bit about decentralization of power and decentralization of water, and why this principle of decentralization is actually so vital to honoring water as life. And water as life isn't just a euphemism. It's not just an activist slogan. It is a principle found in indigenous cultures around the world, found in our own, every ancestral lineage, is this idea of the livingness of water. And of course, where water flows, life grows. So I'm Erik Ohlsen. We're going to talk about water climate resilience. I have this book, The Regenerative Landscaper. If you want more after this conversation about how to be resilient on your land, that book might be supportive to you. Real quick, because we're thinking about things from a whole systems point of view, thinking about how all the threads of nature and human settlement connect and affect each other. I want to just share a few very quick principles of regenerative design, some of the foundations that we use, and how we think about living on this planet of ours in a way that where we can be sustained through crisis and catastrophe. And the first one is trust nature's wisdom. So this really goes to what is happening on your land, where you live. I'm coming here from the land of the Southern Pomo and coastal Miwok. People have been tending these lands for tens of thousands of years in a reciprocal nature. And one of the questions I'm constantly asking myself and the people that I live and work with is how do we become place-based people again, people of place? And that's a huge part of our work in the face of oligarch of an oligarch coup that we're in the middle of. So one thing we do is we trust nature's wisdom. So we appreciate what are the existing ecosystem functions and processes. Um, what kind of grassland do you have? What sort of forest are you living near? What kind of desert? What's going on with the existing ecology, and what sort of wisdom, what sort of life-giving processes already exist? Because when we do this kind of work, we don't want to create added harm. And part of what we find through nature-based principles is that most things are actually in cooperation, working together. Um, so when we work in partnership with nature, that's when we can create lots of abundance. And part of that is relationship design. People tend to like to design things, like design a pond, design a rain tank, design a vegetable garden. And yeah, we need to design those, but it's actually the relationships between elements, between ourselves and water, between the placement of a compost bin and your house. That this the relationship design that we really focus on, and focusing on biodiversity. Biodiversity is the great metric of ecological health. And this is why I say it's very difficult to track all the amazing work that people are doing around the world because it is so decentralized. But what you could track is the increase in biodiversity in your own gardens, your own neighborhoods, your own communities, as a result of the kind of work that we're talking about planting water. Because as you start to plant water in your community, you will notice an increase in biodiversity. We've got to a point here where I am, we've been living here about 10 years, and foxes have just essentially taken over as an apex predator here. They weren't so prevalent when we first got here, but because we built so much biodiversity that attracted various animals and organisms and produced a lot of food and habitat, it's become more and more and more complex. Of course, water is life. We're going to talk a lot about that. We feed the soil life, and through all of this, we can create self-sufficient systems. So that's just a bit of a foundation for a very wide, grand topic that Charles and Starhawk and I speak a lot about, which is regenerative design, ecological design, and it's the social justice impacts that it has. Okay, and so let's kind of land ourselves in the climate crisis moment a little bit. There was a study done. I forget what the university was, maybe university in Maryland, or I'll have to send a link to Charles later to share with you all. But there was a study done a number of years ago about predicting the shifting changes of climate. And one of the things that we know, if we look at this map, this is an older map, but there's all these zones, 1A, 1B, maybe you find out where you are. Like I'm over here in California, north of San Francisco. So I'm sort of in an 8A, 8B area. So these climate zones help us understand what plants are appropriate to plant in these areas. Like what can they who's adapted to this kind of climate zone. But one of the things that we know from the work the university did, that study, is that heat is moving north, warm climate is moving north. And so they've come up with an entire 2080 climate predictions. And you could go onto the map and you can click, like I could click Northern California here, oops, uh, and it will show me what the analog climate for 2080 is where I live. So by the time 2080 hits, I think mine is like somewhere around San Diego is what they predict the climate will be in West Sonoma County in 2080. And of course, this is just a prediction model. Nobody knows exactly how it's going to be, but it can be a little scary. And so what we do is we look at these climate models and say, okay, well, if warm air is moving north, if warm climate's moving north, then how do we plan for that now? We have an opportunity. We have information, we have data. How do we plan for that now? I mean, this may be where avocados are going to grow in 20, 30 years. So maybe we're planting avocado trees. We need to hold and capture as much water as possible so we don't turn into a high desert. So how do we focus on water? So these are the kinds of things that we can do now. And through these actions, we can buffer the extremes through the kinds of ecological features that we implement. So a lot of how we do this is actually through a decentralization process, right? So one of the solutions to oligarchic coup would be to decentralize power, decentralize resilience. We experienced this during the pandemic. What for many folks, people broke into their pods, they became neighborhood communities, they became small collectives that were able to care for each other through mutual aid, through sharing of resources. That was sort of this like testing ground of what's possible. And people naturally moved into a decentralized resilience organizing due to the fact that we weren't really able to go anywhere. Well, it's the same thing with water. The same solutions that mitigate flooding mitigate drought. And that is because what we focus on is taking the water that comes from the sky, the water that runs across the ground, and moving it and spreading it to as many places as possible. Letting every community, whether it be a home or it be a neighborhood or in the urban environment, in parks, um, uh, can have their own little water system, their own decentralized, resilient water system. So in moments of catastrophe, crisis, and just basic day-to-day thriving, we have access to fresh, clean water. Our one of our great mentors and good friend Brock Dolman says it best: slow it, spread it, sink it, store it, share it. And I think this last bit about sharing it and that we know that globally there are currently wars over water, and potentially as climate changes and deserts are moving north, access to fresh water will become more and more limited. And so the likelihood of social crisis is there. And so how we design so that we are in water abundance and we share with each other is part of this process. So where water flows, life grows. I want to give you just some tangible stuff. So here, kind of for the rest of my little talk here, we went from pattern. We're going to go into detail now. If you're interested in water resilience on your own gardens, your own land, your community, now might be probably a good time to take notes because we're going to get into a few details that will hopefully empower you, inspire you to find more water resilience in your life. And so much of it is about being a partner with water and creating systems where water can actually infiltrate into the ground rather than run across the surface. One of the design methodologies we use is called keyline design. I can't get into it now, but if that's a new term to you, definitely look it up. This is a method for transitioning agriculture systems across the world into water harvesting, water abundant landscapes. We also look a lot at the health of soil. Soil itself is a carbon sponge. So the more that we focus on the health of soil, adding organic matter, feeding soil life, using no-till systems so we're not disturbing the soil surface, the soil itself becomes a sponge that can catch and store more and more water every year, every year, every year. So if we want to move into drought tolerant, drought proof gardens and farms to grow our food, our medicine, to sustain us, the carbon sponge is a key component of that. Also, just strategically, we want to store water high in the landscape. I'll talk more about that in a moment. And let's be real. I started at the beginning, say, trust nature's wisdom. And to me, part of that is be site specific. So some of you live in places where you have too much water. It's just lots and lots and lots of water. So just know hand in hand with how we partner with water is also ensuring there's proper drainage where appropriate. And then we drain away from places where we need to less water, and then we catch, infiltrate, and store in safe places outside of that. And through all of this is mitigating erosion so that we're not destroying watersheds in the process of our human development. So a few just techniques that we use to do that. Here, this is actually a recent project in kind of near where I live, and this is about a half an acre orchard that's going in, and these folks will this will be a summer camp for teens, for young teens and adolescents, and they want to grow all their own food here in order to provide homegrown food for their programs. But there's a lot of water, and there's not the well that they have is shared by a whole neighborhood. So in that sense, there's some water scarcity. But in the sense of the water that comes from the sky, that flows off of the land, there's more water than they can possibly handle, and it creates problems. It creates erosion. It cuts out gullies, and has destabilized some hillsides. So what we've done here is we've created these contour ditches that we might call swales, and this allows that water to fill up like a bathtub, and then it just slowly infiltrates into the ground. Now, if you go hiking in the summer in a place like California where we don't get rain in the summer, if you go somewhere during the off season when it's not raining and you find very green, verdant places where everything else is dry, usually that's where water is collecting when it rains, because that water sticks around. It goes into the soil, it sticks around, and so things can stay green longer into the dry season. So we're mimicking that wisdom of nature by planting water where we need it most. And you can see there's some citrus trees here and some other fruit trees and such there. Now, on the right-hand side is something that we do a lot actually up at Starhawk's place, up in the hills of Cazadero, territory of the Cashayapomo, and that's these check dams. And so one of the things that we do when we think about water and partnering is we're also, those of us who live here in California are also living in a fire ecology. And of course, we're experiencing absolute tragedy right now in Southern California. And one of the ways that we can mitigate the extremes of fire while planting water is through thinning out some of the forest in a ecological way. So this is a little sustainable thinning, and then using that material in these check dam systems. So this was a big, deep erosion gully. This was actually here in Occidental, near where I live. But we placed these brush check dams in here. So now as water flows down into this, it hits these check dams and it starts depositing sediment and silt and nutrients behind it, slows the water down. The water gets to infiltrate, and we mitigate erosion that way. So these are just a couple specific techniques that can be used, but you have to use them cautiously and carefully, because the number one thing you want to do is first understand your site before you do any of this. And just for some perspective, 1 inch of rain on 1 acre is approximately 27,000 gallons of water. 1 inch of rain on 1 acre is approximately 27,000 gallons of water. So even when those of us who are in more dryland ecologies, dryland climates, or when a drought hits, like a number of years ago, about 10 years ago, we had a severe drought in Northern California where we got less than half of our average rainfall per year. Even then, the one of the ranch where we work, and some of us live, is about 5 acre farm. Even then, we still caught and captured 2.5 million gallons of water in a drought. So we have to, when we think about drought and we think about dry lands, We also need, and again, the shifting climate and the effects of Trump era policy on our environment and on our ecologies. We want to put things into perspective that sometimes it's not necessarily that there's not enough water. It's that the water that comes to us through the rain, even in a drought or a dry land, moves in and out of the community too quickly. It comes and it goes too fast, but it could be millions and millions of gallons of water in many dry land, deserty ecosystems. When the monsoon hits, millions and millions of gallons of water will flow through the arroyos and the washes and the drainages, but then it just goes on the surface and out and gone. So if we can capture that, knowing that this level of abundance is possible, we can drought proof even some of the driest places on Earth. Here's a little bit more technique. So this is a bit of a rain garden. So that's another kind of cool method, is more of a circular type system. And this is connected to a more contour swale, but this kind of circular depression is another way where you can infiltrate water. And I really like this for more urban environments where there's less space. The properties are smaller, land access is more limited. So you could have a little circular depression like this and then run a downspout right to that. And then you could be planting fruit trees in there in California, specific to this climate. Or in a dry land, you might plant trees right down at the base of that where the water's going to gather. Very simple. You could do it with a shovel in an afternoon and found materials, and you can create water abundance this way. Up here in the upper right, it is actually a check dam that we built on Starhawk's land a couple years ago during a water workshop there. She tells me that these are functioning beautifully in the winter. And then here is an actual pond. Now, ponds are much more expensive to build, so I'm not talking a ton about that now, but obviously, if we want to catch and store water for full resilient communities where we have water throughout the entire dry season, ponds will be much more effective than things like tanks and other water storage systems because you can just store so much. This pond's at my house, and this is about a 30,000 gallon storage system that gets fed through roof water that moves through a tank. And let's talk about tanks for a sec. 1 inch of rain on 1,000 square feet. So now this is rain falling on a roof. Sorry for anybody who's outside the US who's using the metric system. I haven't learned that yet. 1 inch of rain on 1,000 square feet is approximately 635 gallons of water. So again, we have what we might call an above ground well, our roof, can be an incredible source to divert water and catch it and store it on the land. Here's a very basic rainwater catchment system. You have the roof up here, you have a leaf catch, so that way any kind of debris doesn't make it into the tank. Um, you have this first flush system, which is we sometimes use, we sometimes don't, but this allows the very first rain of the season, which might be very dirty, full of material, to sort of get caught in this little pipe first before it goes into the tank. And then in this case, it's a 2,500 gallon tank. So this tank might be dedicated to 10 fruit trees, and that's it. Or we might just hold it in case of fire, or when the power goes out, we have stored water here because a lot of people's water is dependent on power for pumping, and you can get water out of this, out of the outflow, and you can flush your toilets, and you can drink it and use it for your domestic water needs. So we're gonna just tie it all together here with this kind of micro catchment strategy. And so here is a site. And one of the things that we do in ecological design is we want to plan as much redundancy as possible. And in the times that we're moving in right now, the more that we can diversify, again, decentralize our water, decentralize where we're getting resources, the more resilience we're going to have. And one of the ways that we can set up a system like that is we might also call it planned redundancy. So can we have a backup system to the backup system and a backup system to that backup system? That's generally how we want to think about water and food production. So, but water specifically, you can see on this site, we have rainwater tanks that are being fed off of a roof that you can't see over here. And so water comes off the roof, it goes into these tanks. These tanks overflow into this pond. This is about a 30,000 gallon pond. We have road runoff coming from the neighbors that gets moved onto the site, that it gets infiltrated. So now we can grow fruit trees from that caught and stored water. We have gray water coming from the laundry and sinks that are feeding the whole edible system here. We have these contour swales that are catching infiltrating water. And then we have fog drip from the redwoods. And that's a natural, again, trusting nature's wisdom. That's a natural, abundant process. Often in the summers when we get our fog. So we can plant other things in the drip line of these trees that are going to benefit from that fog drip. Now, your site's going to be totally different than mine, and that's fine. It's all about understanding your site, the context of your site, and then and through that, making the decisions that help you decentralize, store, catch water for your own resilience. And with that, I am going to stop there and bring it back to you, Charles, if we have a couple questions we want to ask, or go to the next phase here.
Yeah, I think we'll give a moment. If there are any particular questions people have, you can go down to the bottom of your Zoom window, the little area called reactions. There's a little heart there, I think. Push that and you can put your hand up and then we'll see you. So if there's a couple questions, we'll also have questions at the end too, but there's something burning right now.
Oh, thanks for doing that metric for me in the chat, Charles.
If there's no burning questions, you can always toss them in the chat if there's other things. But I'm going to talk a little about permaculture solutions on a neighborhood scale. Like step back a little bit from our home site and talk a little bit about our neighborhood. So I have a PowerPoint here to get us started. Okay. So what can we do? So we're in this moment in time where we have a new administration coming in. There's a lot of talk about what's going to happen, but what can we do? What we want to watch out for? What we want to be prepared for? So first, I want to start with the permaculture ethics. Permaculture has three basic ethics. We take care of people, we take care of the earth, we take care of the future or generations to come. So this is what we're a goal. And when we think about our neighborhoods and our communities and what we can do in the face of climate change and a new administration that is, at least outwardly saying it doesn't believe in climate change, the first thing we have to do is stop burning. Climate change is really a product of burning. It's not a product of pumping oil per se, because if you make a bucket, it doesn't mean that you're adding to the climate change. You might be adding plastic pollution, which is a huge problem to itself, and degradation of the environment in other ways. But climate change itself is a burning issue, so we need to stop burning. And traditionally, it's like for heating and cooking, but now we burn for transportation. This is cars. They are burning fossil fuels to move. We have our generation, by and large, is a burning process. We need to transition from that, right? We need to be able to heat and cool our homes. We need to be able to light our spaces, be able to use our appliances or technology, but in a way that doesn't encourage burning. And we need to stop land conversion, which is another thing we see that burning is used for, and that is like the burn off landscapes so that you can convert it to something else. So we need to stop the burning. But what are the solutions? And Erik did a great job of talking about what are some of the water solutions. And these are important because in a water solution where you're harvesting rainwater, off your roof and off the roadsides and planting it into ponds and pools means that you don't have to pump that water from the ground. And pumping water's heavy. If anybody's ever carried a 5-gallon bucket of water or carried water around, it's heavy. If you're talking about thousands of gallons, it's a lot of weight. As we pump this water from deep in the earth, or we pump it distances across the landscape, it takes a huge amount of energy. So anything we can do to decrease the energy we need to move water. can make a huge difference. So anything we can do that keeps us from needing to create electricity to move water is a solution. So collecting rainwater is a climate solution, because not just are you growing more food locally and creating a damper environment, all those good things, but you're removing one demand off that energy load that we use from our energy generation. So we need less power plants or smaller ones. We don't need to burn as much. So what our solutions are? Our solutions are things like walkable cities. If we don't need to drive, if we live where we want to be, if we are where we want to be, we don't have to go anywhere else. That's a solution. That's a climate solution. We don't have to burn things to do it. Simple things, turning off lights and unplugging things. Yeah, this isn't going to reverse climate change, but every little piece makes a difference. There are places around the world, especially in South America, they've done some really great activities where they're scheduled on a neighborhood scale. When people do their laundry, like laundry takes a lot of electricity. If everybody does their laundry at the same time, it means we have to have a huge amount of power at those points in time. So you need to have larger power generations. But if you could time it so that everybody in the neighborhood did their laundry at a different time, then you don't need to add that big pulse of electricity all at once. So just by collaborating in your neighborhoods and being like, oh, this block, it does its laundry on this day at this hour, and this block does that hour, and this block does that hour, then you spread out the need for electricity, so you have to produce less at any one given moment. So we can do these designs, these like collective designs, where we decide our behaviors on a neighborhood level, and a city level, on a state or province level. These can make a difference, right? Can we increase efficiency? So this is like catching gray water, or car ride sharing, growing a garden so we don't have to transport our food as far, because there's a expense in transporting food. That's not to say that there isn't some food that makes sense to transport, but the things that we can produce locally, especially the things that have low energy input production, is good. Plants that are high energy input, you may not want to grow them locally. They might be more easily grown somewhere else. It takes a huge amount of energy and water in your place to grow a particular crop. You might want to bring that from somewhere else, but you want to grow the crops that grow easily there. Those are the solution ones, localize. The one thing this current administration, or the new administration coming in, is really looking at is reducing oil or increasing oil and gas exploration. And we have protected many places, especially in the Arctic, but also in the lower states, around environmental issues, and really staying with our environmental issues. We have environmental protection for really, really, really good reasons, and doing the best we can not to backslide on those, because there's no good outcome to creating more oil and gas. Like, we know that is a climate problem. Even if not all of it's burned, some of it will be. And then the last solution that I want to just touch on in this area about burning is just mutual aid and resource sharing. Like, what if it takes a lot of energy and pollution to create a device, a tractor, extra housing? Like, can you share that? Or is there anything that you can share within a community, within your neighborhood or space, that you don't use all the time, that maybe you and your neighborhood could share? So any resource sharing is a good way in which to decrease the demand for production. And the production of things often have a climate negative effect because they usually create pollution. So, and also kind of centering a lot of our activities around who's most vulnerable in our communities, like who needs the support. Because that's another area that we have to put a lot of energy in, is supporting people in our communities retroactively. If there's a disaster or some problem that happens, people who are isolated take more energy to support. But if we were proactive in it, we could be ready for that and not have to be so reactive. Second solution, so stop burning, right? We need to slow down the burning. Second thing we need to do is transition our agriculture. And the couple ways that I see us doing that transition is we need to plant more farmers. Where I'm living here in Nova Scotia, one of the trends that we've had is we have, over the last few decades, farmers have aged out and are aging out. And what happens is farms are being sold. So the number of farms that are in the province, they have dramatically increased, because they've subdivided, but the acreage of under cultivation is smaller. So the number of acres that are being cultivated in farms are smaller because a big farm has been sold up and broken into pieces. And there are new farmers that have come in, small market gardens, small farmers that are intensively managing small plots and producing more food per acre than we did 20 years ago, 15 years ago. So there's more food being produced on less land, and we have more people farming. And this is one of those solutions. Like, can we take large farms as people are aging out and have a larger farm community? These small intensive farms that need less industrial inputs because you have human attention as the input. So diversified farms, farms that aren't monocrops, that are not a single crop mechanically cultivated, but a smaller one that does have some mechanics in it, but has a lot more individual care with a diversity of crops so that you're not as vulnerable to climate shifts, and you can produce more. There's a volume increase. And then shifting to polycultures. Again, this is shifting from that monocrop farm, which are highly productive. Don't get me wrong. Industrial farming is highly productive, though it has a lot of downsides. Can we go into these polycultures, a farm that poly meaning many cultures, many different plants growing, and increase that in the landscape, especially with the perennials. And we have some really great perennial crops that we can start to cultivate, which means you don't have to plant them every year because they're perennial. They come back. It takes less energy to maintain them, and still get a harvest. Maybe your harvest quantity is lower, but your input is a lot less. So for those looking to make a profit, when you have less input, though you might have less output, the economics sometimes work out better if you have a lower input. So it depends on how that goes. So we want to have polycultures. And one of the things that's great about starting to get these small intensive farms from big ones is you liberate a chunk of landscape that was under cultivation, but now isn't. The question is what happens to it? And we need to keep that from being developed. That needs to go back to wild landscapes. Timber stands, forests, areas that can sequester carbon, that can pull carbon out of the atmosphere. So reforesting our landscapes, having both tax policies and kind of a neighborhood ethos and land trusts to really support the idea that agriculture, as it intensifies, the augmented land, the land that is like freed up, can be rewilded. And for you, it might look like forest. Maybe it looks like prairies. Maybe it looks like, marshes. Who knows what it is? In your area, you'll know what that is. But how can we both increase our production by intensifying our farming in local farms, but also rewild the places as we need less land for cultivation? I see a lot of things in the chat, but I can't read the chat right now, so we'll get to that. So feel free to toss anything in there. So we need to build this new generation of farmers. We need to promote kind of a diverse way of knowing. And this is a real shift from kind of some of the industrial agriculture and the agriculture that's been going on, where science-driven agriculture has been kind of a direction we've gone. I'm a huge fan of science, but there's a lot of ways to know something, right? Science is only one way to know things. There's indigenous ways of knowing. There's heart-centered ways of knowing. There's spiritual ways of knowing. There's all different ways that we can know what is real and true and important, right? So how can we marry these together? And I'm suggesting that what we need in permaculture and in our growing society is that we need to marry these ways of, or bring together these ways of knowing, not to say one way is better, like, oh, it's only the scientific way that matters. There's like, no, it's only, the, heart-centered way that matters. No, we need to be able to say, oh no, these go together. When we say science and heart and spirit, all come, indigenous ways of knowing all come together, and they all say, oh yeah, this is the direction we move together. That is a robust system. So how do we allow for diverse ways of knowing and support the intersection? Because we're seeing truth under threat right now. There's a huge threat to what is true and what is known, and disinformation. And I think we have to allow for different ways of knowing, but also look for where they overlap and where they support each other. And again, resisting ecological protection rollback. We need to keep the environmental protection going. So this is my last one of my 3 things we need to think about. Stop burning and re-envision our agriculture system. And then we need to prepare for disaster. And we've seen it in the Carolinas. We've seen it in LA. Over and over, we see this cycle of disturbance, that equals disaster because the disturbance is making life hard. And these are our emergency or crises. Emergency and crises, I think, might be a better frame because we also have things like war. We also have things like housing crisis. These are also disasters from disturbance. So we have climate disaster, but some of the solutions for our housing might be very similar as the ones for our climate disasters. So I want to kind of wrap all these together, this kind of disaster disturbance. We need to prepare, then respond. We need to prepare ahead of time. Think about what's going to happen, what's coming, and then how can we create an ecology to support that? Can we catch water so that we decrease storm runoff? Can we plant our food forest in such a way that absorb the wind so we have less wind damage? Can we grow good food so that when there is disturbance and people get isolated or cut off, that they're not cut off from their food sources? Can we localize our food? Can we localize our medicine in such a way that as communities experience disaster, that they don't lose all of their resources? Can we build soil to grow good food? So we need to get ready. Look at your community. What is it that's likely to strike your community, and where are the weak points? What can we do to prepare for that? And then organizing our mutual aid. So sometimes when we talk about permaculture, we kind of focused on soils and plants and water, but a lot of it's also about our social organizing, which is about how do we set up our mutual aid networks. When I'm saying mutual aid, what I'm saying is like, how do we set up our systems so that if I'm impacted, I have already been in community enough that I know my neighbors can support. But if my neighbors are impacted, the community one over from mine gets impacted, how am I the support system for them? How are we ready to show up for each other? Same as in ecology. When you look at a forest, it's this complex system that supports itself. It's not like one part doesn't support the other. The whole thing is intertwined in such a way that we have the support. So how do we think about our social permaculture along with our ecological permaculture? How do we avoid isolation and really start to share our skills? I think everybody in a community has something to bring. Some people have something to bring because they know how to use a chainsaw. Some people can't use a chainsaw. They might not even be able to walk very easily, but they're the ones who can be by the phone or be the person that people check in with so you don't lose track of your loved ones. Or, somebody else might really be good at helping people deal with emotional crisis. Like we all have skills, right? How do we bring that to bear so that our communities are resilient instead of being in our isolated little bubbles out there? And then after disaster, so, we prepare for disaster, we respond in the moment to a disaster, then we need to remediate, we need to clean up after it, and prepare for cleanup. Think about what would it take to rebuild? And this is, I think, one of these great moments for us is there are all these ways in which the world that we live in may not be perfect. You may look around you and be like, oh, if I could make this, I'd make it different. Like disaster sometimes gives you a chance because things go away that have been there for a long time, or things that you could never change. Oh, yeah, never change. But in disturbed times, they do change. Roads get rebuilt, things get moved. Buildings that were there for a long time, they might be taken down. So like envisioning what the world you want to live in and being ready to rebuild that when the time comes. This picture right here is, I have this culvert on the top. A culvert is a pipe that directs water underneath a road. They've been blowing out commonly in storms because storms are getting bigger, so they're getting washed out. And that's what kind of creates those destroyed areas. Often in a road, when you see a road and then there's like no road and the road again after a storm, it's usually where a culvert was. So these culverts have been blowing out. And there was a particular culvert I watched for years, not far from where Starhawk was. That was down in a low area, and it was being eroded out. Like you could see it was going to fail. Like it was clearly going to fail. Just it was eating away at the road. Like the things were getting undercut. It was looking really bad. And I ended up talking to a road engineer who said, "Oh yeah, I know that one. That one's too expensive for the number of people who use it, and it's too far away, and the permitting is going to take so long. We're not going to deal with it." But eventually a disaster is going to wipe it out, and then we can replace it really quickly. So, that we have a system that's broken when they're like, oh yeah, we're waiting for something to knock the road out so we can replace it because it's going to be too expensive otherwise. Like nobody's going to budget for it. But interesting when they replaced this culvert, instead of looking like the one at the top, which is narrow pipe, which it instead of funneling all the water into a pipe and then forcing it out a little hole, kind of like a fire hose. It kind of shoots the water out in a very concentrated stream, which causes erosion. They replaced it with one of these kind of overpass styles. And these are really great. So because they had the choice, they actually were watching it for a while. They decided instead of putting a pipe back in there, they made a very long flat. See how this bottom of it is really wide? This thing's probably only 2 feet tall, not very high. Probably not much higher than this culvert, but it's wide, so the water that goes through there can meander through. It doesn't have to go through. It doesn't concentrate the water. It allows it to meander. The other great thing about these styles of flat-bottomed water crossings, though they're slightly more expensive, is they're a good wildlife crossing. And we talk about ecology because we know resilience in our environment is important for disasters, to reduce disaster damage. So having a wildlife crossing that allows animals to travel, allows seeds to travel, water travel freely between these, because some animals won't walk across the road, but this is a passageway. So now we get genetic movement for populations and creates migration areas. So this slight change of how we move water under roads, big difference. So think about, how do we rebuild? What do we want it to look like? Are there weak points in our system that we could design better? Where could your neighborhood be a better neighborhood? And how do you get ready for if something comes up where you say, we got to replace that? I've got an idea. Let's replace it with this instead of what we had before. Some of you might have heard in LA they're replacing, they've removed all the environmental regulations so they can rebuild, which can be a disaster. We have them in place for good reasons. Like, is there a way in which we can keep our environmental standards and still provide housing for people and rebuild? And how do we do that? So we need to maintain our environmental health and be able to rebuild. So I'm going to stop there. I've said a whole lot of things. And I know that a lot of things came through the chats, but I did not see them all. So I don't know, Star, Eric's still on, if you caught any of the questions.
Well, there were some questions about where you get help if you want to do this, and some people have answered with some resources. And as Patty pointed out, we do have a whole permaculture program and a whole advanced permaculture program where you can learn these skills and develop them for yourself. And fortunately, one of the good things about this time is lots and lots of people are doing these things.
Yeah, there's lots of small groups. Here's some link to some of the stuff that Earth Activist Training is doing. I'll put in the chat.
So if we don't have questions, I wanted to talk a little bit about fire.
Okay.
Which I know is on all of our minds. Maybe I'll just do that, and then we can get any questions. You'll have some time to think them up by the end. So, fire, I think we've all been thinking about it with all the fires in LA. Fire is one of the most terrifying impacts of climate change, and fire is one of the things we both really need to do something about, and we actually can do something about. This was the way the world looked one morning in the middle of COVID when we woke up and there was so much smoke in the sky that the sun never really seemed to rise very far. And this was what I saw from our land in 2021 when we had 2 fires going nearby and I evacuated. We were lucky in that the fire didn't come to where we were, but we've all seen the potential of what can happen when it does. And this is what it looked like where one of the fires was afterwards. Um, and I'll just say one of the hopeful things about fire is it looks awful when it's passed through, but fire on the land isn't always the complete destruction you think it's going to be. Land can regenerate, but there's a lot of qualifications about that. And a lot of it depends on how extreme and how severe the fire is. So, fire, what do you need for fire? The good old fire triangle. You need heat, you need oxygen, and you need fuel. You put those three things together, and things will burn. Um, People who manage fire and think about fire, fire professionals, talk about every place having a natural fire regime. That is, if humans weren't there, or at least if modern day industrialized humans weren't there, when indigenous people were there, how often would it burn without human intervention? You know, in California, we are a fire ecology. Land is meant to burn. And without humans around, it would burn from lightning. And that's pretty much what would set fires. So each area might have a different length of time between major fires. Then how intense is it? How much energy is released in each area of burning? Um, you know the difference in intensity between when you've got your burner on low on your stove and when you crank it up to high. Uh, One, it might be you got water and it's simmering, and the other is it's a rolling boil. Well, fires are like that as well. Some are more intense than others. And then the severity is what's the ecological impact? You know, a low intensity fire can have a very positive ecological impact. Indigenous people managed the West for tens of thousands of years by burning periodically, so the fires stayed low and relatively low intensity and contributed to the health of the land and the biodiversity. But when you get these extremely severe wind-driven fires like in and around LA, where they get up in the canopy of the trees, where they can be so hot they actually turn the ground into like rock-like baked substance, the severity can be extreme and it can take decades or more for it to recover. So there are plants and trees that evolved with fire, some adapted, like oak trees can often come back after a fire, they can withstand a fire. Some are dependent, some need fire to ripen their seeds or to grow. And there's three basic things that are going to impact the fire behavior. One is the fuels. You know, what is there stuff there to burn? In the LA fires, you had a lot of brushland and chaparral with fuels that were highly flammable, burnable, extremely dry. You also had homes and gardens and landscaping that provided other kinds of fuel. You have topography, the slope of the land. Fire burns more quickly uphill than downhill, spreads more quickly uphill. So in places like the Palisades, you had this combination of fuels and topography, and then the weather, the extreme dryness, the heat, coupled with the extreme winds, made those fires really, really difficult to stop or to contain. And, you know, unfortunately, we're also suffering from this natural or unnatural disaster of lies and misinformation and disinformation. And there's lots of that circulating around about the fires and the fires in LA and whose fault they were. And, you know, should Gavin Newsom have done something? You know, is he to blame? And we love as humans to blame somebody. rather than actually look at real causes. And I think it's vitally important. The more we understand about how fire actually does behave, the more we can look at something like those LA fires and go, well, no, right? It's not that some conspiracy. It is this combination of the perfect combination of these three elements that made these extreme and almost unstoppable fires. So climate change is key to why we're seeing more extreme and devastating fires. And again, it's really important we don't let people slide away from that, trying to blame somebody else or come up with some weird explanation and not look at the explanation that's right in our face and clamoring for us to take action and do something about it. I'm going to kind of skip over these, but basically, why fire moves uphill more quickly is that heat rises. So when it's burning downhill, it's preheating the air above it, and it's actually creating its own wind that will suck the fire up. So what can we do? We can start from your structure and work out, because really it's our homes and our structures and our lives that we're most concerned to protect, and that are most at risk in a fire. So things you can do in your home, if you have a roof that's made of less flammable material, you can get something called a Class A fire resistant underlayment to put under your roof. You can roof it with something that's not going to be burned so easily. Unfortunately, all those beautiful, wonderful, quaint-looking wood shingled roofs are devastating in a fire and not a good solution. But there are things that can help deter the fire. Making sure that the vents in your house are screened so that sparks and embers can't get in. Cleaning up all the mess around your house and taking care of the vegetation. I think a lot of people are talking about having that 5-foot barrier of stuff around your house that doesn't burn, that makes it much more defensible than having windows that are insulated, that can keep out some of the heat. Being careful with your decks, because they can be places where embers collect. Making sure there aren't cracks in your siding. All of those things can help improve your odds in a fire. Because there's 3 ways that structures ignite. The first is directly, the flames come right up and they burn your house. The second is just the radiant heat itself can get so hot that stuff inside smolders and begins to burn. I haven't seen it, but I'm on a listserv where people are talking about some conspiracy video, and someone was saying, oh, I saw it, but then, first I wasn't inclined to believe it, but then I saw these houses and it really looked like they just burned from the inside out, and that must be a sign of, conspiracy. And kind of like, well, no, that is a sign that they burned from one of the 2 major ways structures ignite, either from radiant heat that ignited things inside the house, or from sparks and embers that can bank up against the house or get blown into the house and set things on fire. So that's what we're looking at when we talk about how do we prepare for a fire. And what we're trying to create is what we call defensible space. So here you can see this house had that 5-foot little stretch of stuff that doesn't burn around it. It had some trees there, but the trees were limbed up and there wasn't a lot of brush around the bottom. And you can see how the fire came very, very close, but then was stopped either by itself or because the firefighters were able to use that space to stop the fire and the house was saved. So you want that 5-foot barrier around with unburnable stuff. Then you want 30 feet around that where you really reduce the amount of vegetation, where you may have some trees, but you keep them limbed up, where you're creating an area that's going to be easy for firefighters to slow or stop a fire. And then for 100 feet around that or more, if you are on the top of a slope, then you want, again, to perhaps have a few more trees, perhaps have some shrubs, but have them spaced so they're not up against each other. Have the area very fire resistant. And then up to 200 feet or more, you want what we call a shaded fuel break. So where you still have trees and the trees create shade on the ground, but you've got space in between them. The canopies aren't crammed up against each other, and they're limbed up, they're thinned out, and it's easier to defend. So those three things, weather, topography, fuels, thing we can most impact are fuels. And this is what a lot of our forests look like. We call it dog hair forests. You know, they're full of masses of small trees, of shrubs, of just kind of a solid mass of burnable stuff. This is not how they looked. When indigenous people were managing our forests, they had something like 45 trees to the acre. Today, here where I live in Sonoma County, it's more like 400 trees to the acre. Instead of big, beautiful, full canopy trees with space around them, we've got all these tiny little shrubs and trees and all these different kinds of fuels. So we're looking at especially removing what we call ladder fuels, fuels that can kind of be like a ladder a fire can climb up to get up into the canopy. So what we do is we thin and prune, separate the trees, clear out some of the smaller and thinner ones, limb them up so that a ground fire doesn't jump up into the canopy. And this actually helps improve the health of the forests as well. You can create shaded fuel breaks like we were talking about. So we're taking something that looks like this or this and turning it into something that looks more like this. So if a fire comes through there, it can burn on the ground, but it's not going to jump up into the trees. We've done a lot of that in our community over the last 3 years. We've had work parties all through the winter working on the edges of our roads, because one of the things you want to be most careful about is access. How can you get in and out? How can people evacuate during a fire? More people die trying to evacuate than in any other way in these big fires. And how can the first responders get in? Sometimes we're able to get a chipper and chip the stuff. A lot of times we've been doing pile burns. Sometimes we're able to make biochar. That was my experiment doing it with a little kiln, which wasn't terribly effective in terms of our work days because the mass of material we're dealing with is just so huge. But there are other ways to make biochar where you just put the fire out kind of halfway when it's down to a charcoal kind of smoldering and get left with some of that charcoal. That's another one we did in Sweden, just making biochar in a bathtub. If we have time at the end, I'll talk more about biochar. But we want to honor indigenous wisdom. Again, indigenous people have managed these forests for tens of thousands of years with burning, and they understand how to burn, when to burn, how to do it in a sacred way. And we have also begun doing, we can't do the same exact kind of cultural burns we could do if we were indigenous people, but we can do what we call prescribed burns, which are planned, which are designed to kind of, again, have those low intensity fires to improve the health of the land and protect it from catastrophic fires. This is a plant called dogbane, and our friend Redbird Willie talks about how indigenous folks would plant it in areas that they knew would burn because it needs to burn. Burning helps it, and it's something that they use for basketry. And some of the areas that burned in the Santa Rosa fire in 2017 are the areas where they would traditionally plant and harvest dogbane because they knew, due to the winds and the topography and the alignment, that those are areas that are likely to burn. So prescribed burn is very exciting. You first clear a fire line, make sure you've got a place to stop it. You can use a drip torch to start it, start a little fire line, and carefully watch and manage it so that it burns where you want it to burn and doesn't escape. And we've done a number of them up here. And again, they also help improve the health of the land and the biodiversity because we're in an area that needs that fire. And it's what it looked like afterwards. A year later, you couldn't even tell this area was burned. And that's my dog. Another thing we've been doing is favoring the oaks and the hardwoods by removing some of the pines that overgrow them. And then ultimately there's also grazing for fire prevention and combining fire, the burning, and the grazing, because once you burn it, things grow back and you have to keep it down somehow. So now we burned a big field called the Fern Field up here a couple of years ago. This year we're grazing it with our cows to graze down the grasses. There's the dog again. So I'm gonna stop now and we'll see. We're a little over time, but if there are questions, I'm happy to stay and answer.
There's one question about how would this apply in an urban perspective, like in cities?
So some of the structural hardening thing applies very well in cities. You know, whether your roof's like, whether your windows like, what's your house made of, what do you have growing around it? This is what breaks your heart as a permaculturalist. Your instinct is to grow vines over everything and have lovely, mixed food forests of trees and shrubs and every single layer being filled with vegetation. But if you're in a fire ecology, you might not want to do that right around your house. you might want to rethink your landscaping. Make sure you've got that fireproof area, especially that 5-foot barrier around your house. Make sure you've got plants and lawn and grass that you keep watered as much as possible. And it's not always easy during a drought, but uh, there's all kinds of lists of fire-resistant plants. Some of them are they aren't really based on research. They're much more anecdotal. But the point is, if you've got plants in your yard that are well watered and where you have pruned away some of the dead stuff, it's going to be less susceptible to fire than if you've got like a massive rose bush where half of it's dead underneath and it's all dry and it's full of leaf litter. And working with your neighbors, looking at the neighborhood and saying, well, where are our hazards? Where might a fire come from? How can we help each other to clear up and prepare and make sure that we can do our best not to be a hazard to each other. And also really looking at yourself and your own capacities. The Australians are really good about telling the people, either plan to stay and defend your home, and if so, you need to know how to do that. You need to be physically prepared to do that. You need to have some of the right equipment to do that, which might be as simple as having clothing that's not made out of artificial fabrics, because they are mostly made out of something that goes back to petroleum. And when, if you've got lovely polyester clothing on, the fire will melt it into your skin. So you want natural fibers, leather boots. If you have all that, you might be better off staying and defending than trying to evacuate in the middle of an emergency. But if you don't, and you're not prepared for that, or you're older, like many of us are, and you don't move so quickly, then evacuate early. Don't worry. Don't necessarily wait until the authorities tell you to evacuate. If you're smelling smoke, if you're feeling nervous about it, have a plan before there's a fire. So you don't have to think it up on the spot when you're starting to panic and get anxious. And I always say it's like if you're asking, am I an alcoholic or not? Asking, should I evacuate or not? With both of them, if you're asking the question, you probably should say yes. You're going to be safer saying yes than saying, no, 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 I'll be okay. So, for me, I'm 73. I don't move very quickly. I've got arthritis. I feel like the most help I can be to my community in a fire is to get out early so that I don't become someone the firefighters have to try to protect and take care of. If I were young and fit, I might join the volunteer fire department, get the training, and plan to stay and defend. So know who you are and know what your capacities are.
If I could add one thing, just having watched the LA fires, and that LA is designed to move water out. And the first thing Erik talked about tonight was like, how do you keep water in the landscape and keep it wet? Like, if you have a choice between turning your landscape into a parking lot where all the water leaves as soon as it falls on it so that no fire could ever burn it up, you are making a super dry landscape for everybody. Like, some vegetation in the right way that keeps the humidity present, but the flame height of fires low, allows for fire defense to happen, but also does all the other biological benefits. Like, trees make us healthier. Like, we know that in cities. Cities without trees are unhealthy cities to be in. Cities without moisture burn easier. All these great benefits to having vegetation. So I would say, don't don't hide from vegetation. Just think about it. How do you keep your flames low and keep your land covered and harvest all the water you can so you keep it as damp as possible versus trying to make it all go away so you have an impermeable like fortress that is totally unlivable because it's so unpleasant. So
Yeah. I see something in the chat about someone who planted some native stuff around their house that didn't burn even when their house did. And that's one of the amazing things about fire. Um, if we had more time, I could show you pictures from the burn on the fern field where you the whole grassy area burned, but there were coyote bushes that didn't burn, or that only half of them burned and half of them are still green. There were even blades of grass that didn't burn. It's if it's a low intensity burn, a lot of things do survive. And if you look at pictures like of the LA fire, like you'll see pictures where it's black and there's houses that are destroyed and the palm trees next to them are still green. So, yeah, you can't necessarily count on your toy on protecting your home from fire, but there are things that can survive. And even in a catastrophic fire, like in LA, some things survive and some things don't.
well, we've made it to our hour.
Mhm.
And I want to respect the time of everybody's here, and I'm so grateful for people to come and our awesome interpreter. Thank you, Dionysus, for joining us again.
Yeah,
Thank you to Erik for his inspiring presentation and Starhawk presenting about fire. So thank you all for joining us.
yeah. And Eric, we'd love to get you back. Those check dams are working beautifully, and we want to do more.
We have a couple of our events coming up. So we have two more things today at 3 to 4 Pacific time. We have groups, guilds, and communities that Starhawk and Diane Johnson are going to be doing. And then at 6 to 7:30 p.m. tonight, we'll have a ritual of resilience and resistance. So come join us for that.
Yeah. And we also have a lot of wonderful programs ongoing, including advanced permaculture that talks more deeply about water and fire and forestry and designing for disaster. I have a Substack where I've been doing a series of writings on movement building called The Movement We Need. And I invite you to check that out. I also have a podcast that goes with it that we've just now released on, I think, pretty much all the platforms you can get podcasts on. So you can look for that. And we'll be back at 3 with a wonderful friend, Diane Janine Johnson, to talk about how we organize, how we create groups, guilds, things during this time, how we can exemplify the kind of diversity and resilience we really want. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Charles and Eric. Thank you to our whole team.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.